If I had to pick the most disappointing anime of 2019, it would hands down go to Boogiepop Doesn't Laugh, an adaptation of one of the most influential light novels of all time by a rising anime director with several hits already under his belt. Sounds like something that anyone could get excited about. But by the time the third episode was over, it was clear that this was a massively tone-deaf production that completely missed the entire point of both the message the original light novel tried to convey and how it conveyed that message through its structure. I could probably go in depth and cover the entire series and how it sells us a totally hollow and unsatisfying shell of the original story, but for the most part I'm gonna stick to the first book, which corresponds to the first 3 episodes. And if you're familiar with anime based on light novels, those numbers should probably be your first clue that something is very wrong here. You see, much like how adapting a manga into an anime requires the proper adaptation rate at which to cover a certain part of the story over a certain number of episodes, light novels also have a sweet spot for adaptation rates, though admittedly it's a bit less concrete than the chapter to episode mindset of manga. Because light novels don't have a page or word length requirement for chapters or volumes, there is no one ratio that can be referred to. But generally speaking, a single volume of a light novel can be comfortably adapted across a span of 5 to 8 episodes of anime. Maybe 4 if you really push it. Again, depending on the length of each individual volume. Any longer than that and the story's going to feel stretched out. Any shorter and it'll feel like the story is rushing through things too quickly for their impact to be felt as intended, and with Boogiepop we find ourselves squarely in the latter case. Though this might not be too obvious after just the first episode. In fact, that first episode mostly adapts just the first chapter of Volume 1, with only about 2 minutes devoted to Chapter 2, theoretically giving it plenty of breathing room to manage the pacing, though it also has its own issues that we'll get into later. It's not until episode 2 that the story really starts to unravel, which makes sense since there are still 4 chapters left of the first volume. If we go by number of pages, Chapter 1 is 43 pages long in the most recent printing by 7 Seas Entertainment, and even then this episode felt a bit rushed and didn't have quite the emotional impact it needed, and so we can assume that, in the case of Boogiepop, 43 is higher than the necessary page-to-episode ratio. Meanwhile, chapters 2 through 5 are 149 pages long, but are crammed into just 2 episodes, meaning that episodes 2 and 3 theoretically cover 74.5 pages each, almost twice as fast as episode 1. Of course, I say theoretically because the anime ended up cutting significant portions of the light novel in order to squeeze everything into such a tight space, which is one of the reasons why these episodes are such a fucking train wreck. This also might have some relation to how the anime was broadcast, but that's a whole other thing that we'll have to discuss later on. For now, let's get into some of the more specific points of the story, which is where this anime truly falls apart. Coming back to the light novel after being away from it for a while, it's kind of amazing that literally everything you need to know about the message of the first book is presented as plainly as possible in that book's prelude. It's just barely over 3 pages long, and yet somehow the anime managed to miss practically everything about it that was important to the story. The reason for why the chapters are structured the way they are, the major themes that the book goes out of its way to present to the reader, the sense of helplessness that the characters are supposed to feel, it's all right there, but the anime just chucked it all right in the trash. I highly encourage that you at least read this prelude. Hell, I'll post it in the damn comments section if I have to, because it's so blatantly obvious what Boogiepop is going for, and yet the anime still didn't catch on. One of the most interesting elements of this is the fact that the events of this book are conveyed to us in a narratively unique manner. Each of the 5 chapters covers a different time frame of the major events of the story, not necessarily in chronological order, but each one is told through the perspectives of different characters and what part of the plot at large they interacted with. Chapter 1 covers Takeda interacting with Boogiepop, 2 is Suema getting to know Kirima Nagi, 3 is Saotome meeting the Manticore and helping it eat more humans, 4 is Kimura reflecting on his relationship with Kamikishiro and her ramblings about echoes, and 5 is Nitoki's encounter with the Manticore and the Manticore's ultimate demise. On a structural level, this is an excellent storytelling device that can generate intrigue in the reader. The whole crisis is resolved by the end of the first chapter, but we never truly know what that crisis was or how it was resolved, and so we continue reading to see the story from a different perspective in order to find out. However, this mechanic also has a more thematic meaning behind it. In the prelude, Nitoki describes the Manticore event as such. The actual events probably form a very simple story. From a distance, they appear to be quite confusing, to have no clear threads connecting them whatsoever. But the reality is that this is undoubtedly a much more straightforward, commonplace tale. But from our individual standpoints, none of us were quite able to see the whole picture. All of the people who somehow had a part in this story were unable to see beyond their own unique roles. In a sense, one could view this as a more metaphorical take for how broader ideas should be discussed, especially in the context of culture at large. Most issues in society cannot be properly viewed from a single perspective. Rather, it is necessary to understand multiple perspectives to understand how things got the way they are, instead of just viewing it from your own perspective and how the situation helps or hurts you specifically. This structure is kinda present in the anime, but also misses another major point of why the story is split up like this in the first place. As previously stated, the first episode is almost entirely dedicated to Chapter 1, but then they shove almost all of Chapters 2 through 4 into Episode 2, severely truncating these chapters to the point where it feels more like a series of Spark Notes entries than an actual narrative. Hell, the main character of Chapter 4, Kimura, is cut entirely from the anime, and all of his relevant dialogue is transplanted onto Kirima, which is a whole other waste of a thematic idea I could dissect for several more paragraphs, but let's keep this ball moving. As a result, these characters are less impacting and feel less memorable than anything from the first episode, and certainly less than they are in the book. The structure of the book implies that every perspective is important to understanding the full picture, which is absolutely true considering how much detail is put into characterization and motivation for everyone involved in these chapters. But by cramming everything into a much smaller space, a lot of important character details get cut entirely. Most of Suema's backstory is cut, which makes her pursuit of Kirima seem kind of nonsensical, and her perspective as someone who doesn't easily fit into social settings because of her personal interests is cut entirely, turning her into a bland exposition dumping machine. Kamikishiro's character barely has any character left at all, with her romantic entanglements being reduced to a plot device rather than a manifestation of her stress. A huge portion of her highly benevolent interactions with Echoes is also cut, which makes Echo's decision to save humanity feel mostly unearned in the anime because Kamikishiro's kindness wasn't hammered into us like it was in the book. This content cutting isn't solely relegated to episode 2 though. All 3 episodes suffer this to some degree, such as Takeda's relationship with Boogiepop in episode 1. By the end, it appears like Takeda is desperate to keep Boogiepop around to defeat more evil within the school, but by cutting most of his internal monologues that tell us how he feels about Boogiepop and his situation, which we'll discuss again later, their interactions in the anime simply don't have enough weight to them, and so this attachment feels out of place and kind of forced. By far though, the character who got the worst treatment as a result of this, at least the one who actually made it into the anime, was Saotome. While the novel showed us his slow descent from normal-looking teenager with some mildly disturbing psychological hang-ups to full-on murderous sociopath, the anime paints him as innately evil right from the get-go, which is not only incredibly boring, but also completely undermines one of the book's main themes. Much like everyone else in this story, Saotome is a victim of societal pressure to fit in and go along with what everyone else is doing, be that in school or more in his social life. But whereas Kamikishiro takes it in stride, and Kirima just decides to play her own game and avoid it entirely, Saotome is unfortunately burdened with some much darker thoughts that, having been left unchecked, lead him to becoming a more cynical and emotionally detached person who only puts on the facade of an average teenager. Much like how Kamikishiro is meant to represent the ultimate good of humanity, Saotome was meant to represent the ultimate evil, one that doesn't show any true empathy towards other human beings and is only out to satisfy himself. My favorite example of this comes when he discovers Yurihara's body in the club room, and his first thought upon realizing she was dead was relief that he hadn't signed the club registry for the day, meaning that he could just leave and wouldn't have to deal with the hassles of a murder investigation. And that's exactly what he planned to do before the Manticore revealed itself and tried to kill him. In the anime, Saotome notices Yurihara's body and then is immediately attacked by the Manticore, completely removing this disturbing apathy from him. And this dumbing down of his character is constant throughout the anime. No longer is he a master of social manipulation who can slip the Manticore's drug into Akiko's drink in full view of 2 other students that they took with them on their date, before allowing said students to go fuck behind the dumpster or something while he carries Akiko's slowly decaying body to the Manticore. Anime Saotome just slips the drug into her glass during karaoke when no one else is around. What an incredibly boring simplification of one of the book's most interesting characters. It makes me want to die even more than Saotome, which is another idea that's barely covered in the anime at all, but let's move on. Characters aside, another of Boogiepop's major issues comes from its setting, in that the anime decided to modernize itself instead of being a period piece. I don't know why so many new adaptations of older properties are so deathly afraid of being period pieces, but in any case, the first Boogiepop novel was published in February of 1998, which puts it squarely in the middle of what is known in Japan as the Lost Decade. Long story short, Japan's bubble economy of the 80s popped in the early 90s, leading to excessive financial and social unrest as youths who were basically promised the world ended up walking into a failing job market because of the financial mistakes of previous generations. From a more emotional perspective, the Lost Decade was an era that, for many people, instilled an ever-present feeling of helplessness and abandonment. And it's a sentiment that's very common in media from that era. If you've seen Evangelion, which came out just a few years before Boogiepop, then you probably know what I'm talking about, and Boogiepop is no different. In Chapter 3, Saotome takes Akiko's corpse to a parking garage that he refers to as one of the country's forgotten debts. So the idea of the Lost Decade is explicitly present in the text of Boogiepop, and modernizing it for the anime completely ruins the intent. This is also why the Discipline Committee scene in episode 1 is so disappointing. It cuts out almost everything Takeda thinks about during this scene that conveys this story's identity as a product of the Lost Decade. In the book, he's constantly thinking about how the teachers simply don't care about the students despite the speeches they give about how important it is for students to come to them with their problems. Students are literally disappearing without a trace, and the school and its faculty often seem more concerned with distancing themselves from the students and branding them as troublemakers than they are with actually figuring out what happened. They are constantly portrayed as showing contempt for the students as a whole rather than being empathetic towards them, as Takeda rattles on about how the system is powerless to do anything. It isn't just Kirima Nagi that they hate. She's just the most obvious one to make an example of. So obvious that even the students have taken up a similar attitude towards her. Rather, the entire student body is exhibited as being severely neglected by their educators when it comes to their social well-being. So when I watch the anime adaptation of this scene, and all it shows is a few lines of dialogue from the teacher, while Takeda is staring at his phone waiting for Toka to text him back, it seems pretty obvious to me that whoever wrote this scene had no idea what it was supposed to convey and simply used it as a tool for exposition. Come to think of it, one of my biggest gripes gripes with the anime on a narrative level is the massive lack of internal monologue. I know this concept is often seen as a negative by some anime fans in a show don't tell kind of sense, but in Boogiepop, a lot of these internal narrations are absolutely essential to understanding the characters that they come from. Without these narrations, we don't understand most of Suema's motivations for pursuing Kirima, Takeda's growing attachment to Boogiepop, the sense of confusion and fear that Nitoki experiences during her confrontation with the Manticore, or literally anything significant about Saotome's character. Yes, there are probably better ways to convey these ideas than multiple internal monologues, but the anime straight up cuts them entirely, completely eviscerating some of the book's greatest characters in the process. Having it set in the Lost Decade also gives Boogiepop the opportunity to have a stronger counter-message within its narrative. In both a literary sense and in terms of the ideas that the story references, Boogiepop is a surprisingly romantic story. At its core, despite the gloom and doom that is embedded into its setting, it still retains a more hopeful outlook. Boogiepop constantly reaffirms that it's up to regular people like Takeda and Toka to seize their own futures and change the world for the better. Another idea that is severely truncated in the anime. This idea is pervasive throughout the book, but is most plainly apparent in how Shiro, a character who wasn't even important enough to mention until right now, kills the Manticore. Boogiepop might have helped trap the Manticore, but it was ultimately Shiro, an ordinary human and possibly the least interesting one in the entire story, who finally kills it. The story of Boogiepop is one about humans taking control of the utter chaos and despair that surrounds their lives and managing to survive it despite said chaos and despair. And these ideas are almost completely absent in the anime. This is also why people complaining about the anime removing Boogiepop's whistle in the first arc are actually very justified in making what would otherwise sound like an extreme nitpick. In the book, Boogiepop is often heard whistling an unusual tune, which is eventually identified as a motif from Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, which is an opera composed by Richard Wagner, a composer who is often at the forefront of discussion regarding music of the Romantic era. To oversimplify a very complex idea, the Romantic era was a period of explosive emotional expression in the world of art, having broken free from the restraints of the Classical era, and in terms of narrative art, tended to place much more emphasis on the idea of the individual. This idea loops right back around to what I previously mentioned about everyday people taking matters into their own hands. Another brief but still important criticism I have about this not being a period piece is that it drastically changes the role that technology plays in the story. In Chapter 2, when Suema enters Kirima's room, she described her computer setup as one that takes up a significant portion of the room and practically spills onto the floor. In the late 90s, computers were still pretty bulky, especially those that Kirima Nagi was likely using to maintain the data she used to keep track of the Manticore's victims. And this description is symbolic of how Kirima's obsession with defeating the Manticore has overtaken her entire life. But now the series is set in modern times, so all the computer equipment is much smaller and neatly stored away on shelves and under desks, so the symbolism is entirely lost. Fucking great. Not only that, but the prevalence of high-end technology also ends up diminishing Kirima's role in the story. A setup like Kirima's would have been extraordinarily expensive in the 90s, but because Kirima is living off a large inheritance, she can easily afford technology that no one else can. However, when you set Boogiepop in an age where everyone has something that gives them access to the entirety of human knowledge in their pocket, it makes Kirima's pursuit feel significantly less impressive, thus making her feel less important to the overall story. Of course, the narrative itself also does that by drastically cutting her screen time, but the point still stands. This show has fucked up in so many ways that it's almost impossible to count, and I still haven't even gotten to the absolutely baffling way that this anime was broadcast. I don't know what possessed the production committee behind this project to package it the way that they did, but Boogiepop's broadcast is one of the most bizarre I've run into so far. The first two episodes were broadcast back to back on the same day, which isn't too out of the ordinary at this point, but then around the halfway point of the season they hit us with 5 episodes all at once, with 4 of them covering the entirety of Volume 6, Boogiepop at Dawn, before jumping back to a regular schedule to cover all of Volume 5, King of Distortion. So why adapt the story like this? Was Boogiepop at Dawn so important that it had to be broadcast all at once and precede a book that was actually written before it? And why was Volume 4, Boogiepop in the Mirror, cut entirely? Now, I'm not a huge expert on Boogiepop, but I have felt a burn like this once before in regards to readaptations of beloved light novels. And if I had to hazard a guess based on Boogiepop's publication history, I'd say that Boogiepop at Dawn was one of the more popular volumes of the light novel, considering that during Boogiepop's initial run in the West in the mid-2000s, 7 Seas skipped In the Mirror and King of Distortion and went straight to At Dawn. So, because At Dawn might be a fan favorite, they needed to do something special for it, which apparently meant broadcasting it all at once. Even if they had aired it like a regular anime, that would mean that the series would end halfway through the spring season instead of right at the end of the winter season, because this series is 18 episodes long. Now, I don't know exactly how the exchange of money works within the anime industry, especially when it comes to how they decide to broadcast a show, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption that more episodes equals more money that needs to be spent. And based on the mindset behind this production already feeling incredibly hollow, I'm willing to bet that the production committee didn't want to shell out for 2 full cores. At the same time, they probably also wanted to adapt the core Boogiepop experience, which meant that they couldn't skip books 2 and 3 versus Imaginator. But then why adapt King of Distortion at all? Maybe it is one of the more popular volumes and they needed to include it. But why make it the finale? Why cut In the Mirror entirely? Did they really not have enough faith in this project to make it 2 cores? Or are they just penny-pinching bastards who hate art? Is it Madhouse's fault? Did Dengeki Bunko just not give a shit? Is Boogiepop the serial killer? Why does Takeda feel so attached to Boogiepop by the end of the first episode? I mean, I know because I read the fucking book, but it makes no sense in the anime. What about Kirima? Is Kirima the serial killer? Did Kirima kill Epstein? Is Epstein a member of the institution? Is Echoes an alien? Is Kamikishiro a Christ figure? Am I a Christ figure? Am I the devil? 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 Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourke Tenjoin, Christine Seibert, Call Me Catlord, Ryan Johnson, Jennifer Spencer, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.